Hey everybody, it's Robert coming to you with Sidestep Adventures. I'm out here with Mr. Dan AKIN, local historian, and we are on part of what used to be the Whitehead Sparks Plantation, and we're at the Whitehead Sparks Slave Cemetery right now. Now this is a cemetery that I've actually filmed before a long time ago, and it's one that is special to me. I passed by this tombstone. There's one lone tombstone out here and maybe 200 graves. I passed by this tombstone for many years and always wondered about it and never knew what it was until Dan gave me the history of it, and I came out here and filmed it, and I think it was one of the very first slave cemeteries that I ever filmed. And of course I filmed, documented many more around this area since then, but this one's always very special to me. So we're going to come back out here with the historian and have another look at it. Think about it a minute.
If you the one that found this and shoot it up, the damage put around.
Yeah, it was knocked over. So this is a very special tombstone here. This is an MTA stone, and this was a fraternal organization for African Americans after emancipation. This was founded by two former slaves, and this organization offered burial benefits, also a headstone for people who were a member of it. So very interesting grave here, and one that's pretty rare. I've actually been contacted by the MTA Museum after documenting a few more of these, who are very interested in locating them all. The museum is in Arkansas. They were interested in locating all of them for a database. Now Dan, what do you know about Samantha Street?
Well, most of what I know has already been covered in one of your other videos, but just to kind of recap it, Samantha was born here on this plot of land. This used to be the William Whitehead Plantation. William Whitehead came here as one of the first settlers, and he became very prosperous. He wound up owning, I think, close to 100 slaves by the time that the Civil War came on. Samantha is actually listed by age on the 1850 slave census index, 9-year-old female. So she was born about 1841. From there, she's listed on the 1870 census after emancipation. She had married a man by the name of Hilliard Street. Samantha's name, of course, originally was Samantha Whitehead. She married Hilliard Street, and she appears in the 1880, the 1900, the 1910 censuses. And of course, she died January 23rd of 1918. But I think everyone around here grew up passing by this cemetery, because this was the road to our favorite swimming hole down here for everyone who lived or was raised in this area. It was also the road to the city dump, which used to be down here just a little ways. And everybody in town has passed by here at one time or another. And we all knew that this little grave was here, but growing up here, I never knew the backstory of it until accidentally one day I was talking to an old friend of mine, Miss Margaret Pitts, who was a descendant of William Whitehead. She was his great-great-granddaughter. And Miss Margaret lived to be 104 years old. She died in 1998 at the age of 104. Well, back in the late 1980s, I was talking to her one day, and she mentioned that one time when there was snow on the ground, that her mother was at a meeting at the Methodist Church, a women's missionary meeting, and she said Aunt Samantha and I and my sister Bessie cooked sausages on that fireplace, and she pointed to the fireplace in her den. And she said that, when I said, Aunt Samantha who? She said, Samantha Street. She said she was my mammy growing up. And I said, now that wouldn't be the Samantha Street that is buried down on the Jordan Road. And she said, yes, it is. And anyway, she went into great detail about this lady, about her life and what she knew about her. And this was really a remarkable woman. She not only raised the Pitts children, but she raised 3 children of her own, maybe more, but I know of at least 3. She helped to raise her grandchildren who lived nearby. Those children, we've later found that they have descendants who live here. and it's a very large family to this day. There's a lot of them that still live around this area. She has descendants all over the United States. Some of them moved to California. They live in lots of places away from here. But Samantha had a very interesting life. She lived her entire life right here, and as far as I know, she never went anywhere traveling. She was just, when she died, they buried her right here on this place where she was born. But she did live most of her life in town instead of out here on the farm. After emancipation, she moved to the Body Plantation, which was owned by her, it was owned by Mr. William Whitehead's daughter. And she moved there, and when Ms. Body moved to Atlanta, Samantha went to work for Mr. Pitts. And then Mr. Pitts, when his son William Pitts married, she went to work there, and she worked there until the day she died. And upon her death, Miss Margaret Pitts told me that she helped get the application or whatever it was that they had to fill out to do this, because she said no one in the family knew how to read or write. So she helped to get the application filled out through this lodge, which Samantha was a member of. And she also had to pay for this headstone to be put here, because this headstone arrived at the Waverly Hall Depot and was put on the platform there, and they were notified that it was here. Of course, someone had to bring it from up there down here and put it in place. Well, she told me that at the same time she went ahead and purchased a headstone for Mr. Hilliard Whitehead, which is Samantha's husband, and he supposedly is buried on one side or the other right here. But his headstone has vanished. Now, we've looked around, it doesn't seem to be here. There's been a lot of logging in here over the years. I think they've tried to protect this as much as they could, but this is almost right on the edge of the cemetery, so if it fell over, it could have been bulldozed or taken away or whatever. And also, if it made its way over here near the road is so close that when it was graded, it could have been covered up. But at any rate, it's not here now.
So there's a couple things that I want to add to that too. You mentioned the logging, and the first time I filmed this, the lady that lives across the street stopped by and said that she was so glad that someone was taking notice of this, because the logging operation was coming in here the last time they logged all around here, which wasn't that long ago. And she actually came out here and flagged them down and said, no, you can't log in this area. So this cemetery came this close to being destroyed. But another thing about where Hilliard is buried, and this is just a personal theory of mine, but if you notice, whereas all of the other graves throughout here are indentions in the ground, Samantha's grave is still mounded on top. So that means that she was buried very well. Possibly a brick vault or rock vault or something in there like that, because we have an indention on this side of Samantha, but over here on this side of Samantha where there's another grave, this one is still mounded as well. So I personally believe that this is probably Hilliard's grave and that he was buried in the same manner that Samantha was. Would you agree with that?
I do agree with that. Hilliard had a very good job working for Mr. Pitts in the store. He was a night watchman. He was just a laborer in the store during the day. He was a very trusted individual, and he was paid a salary back in the days when very few people were paid salaries. They of course lived in a house just behind what was Pitt's store in Waverly Hall. It's all part of a pasture now, and there's a big oak tree there near where the house was. And he worked there, and Mr. Pitts actually dealt in caskets. He dealt in funeral goods and supplies, and I would imagine that he furnished whatever was needed for the streets when they passed away. I don't know what year Mr. Hilliard passed. I don't know if it was before or after Samantha. I have not looked that far into that. But back then, along about the time that these two would have passed away would have been when some of the Pitts family had their graves fixed out at the Waverly Hall Cemetery, and in those days they bricked up graves. The grave was dug, a brick liner was built, the casket was let down, and then bricks were placed over that in kind of a little tomb. There was that, and there was also there were some concrete vaults available at the time. That was not real common here in this part of the South, but it was in the cities. I'm thinking that these graves here were probably bricked up very well. And that's why there's still a mound of dirt on top of both of them. But whereas the other graves everywhere around here are sunken where the casket decomposed over the years.
So if you notice on this grave, it has her birth date as being 1868. And per Dan, you believe that this was a marriage date, right?
That was close to her marriage, right? I believe her marriage took place in 1867. It was either 67 or 68. Her marriage license is recorded in the Harris County Courthouse, where she married Hilliard Street. And I believe someone confused that date with her birth date at some point when they did this application. Whoever helped fill out the application may have said, well, what's the earliest known year? And her daughter Flora was born in 1868, and Flora might have said, well, I was born in 68, and somebody put that date down by mistake. So it's a fascinating mystery now.
All right, so we've looked at Samantha's grave here, and again, this is the only marked stone. When I say marked, I mean stone that has information on it. We're going to look at some more. There's probably in the neighborhood of maybe 200 graves out here. I actually came out here about a month ago and flagged. I started flagging the graves out here so I could get an actual count of how many were out here. And it's really fascinating to walk through here and see how well laid out the cemetery is, and also be able to see, with the help of the flags, how many graves there are out here. And again, I only started flagging. I'd say only 25% of the cemetery is flagged, but it gives us an idea. So let's take a look. All right, so here we have a row of graves that are flagged, and I mean, this is just where you can begin to see the amount of graves out here. This is a very small portion of the cemetery. So if you look over here, this is the row that Samantha is. We've got one over there that's an indentation with a flag in it. So we have 1, 2, 3. There's 3 in that row. And coming down here is another row of, I believe, 3. And then behind that is another row and another row, and it just continues. So this cemetery is really, really well laid out. A lot of people have kind of I think a misunderstanding of how these enslaved burial grounds are laid out, because in many of them that I've seen, they've all been laid out very neatly in rows, whereas they would appear at first to be kind of haphazardly buried. So it's very interesting to see how well that they were laid out. And again, we'll continue just seeing just rows and rows of graves out here, and that's also how you can see how quickly the numbers add up. So here again, where I'm standing is we're surrounded by graves. If you look down here from my vantage point, you'll just see just a row of flags that are graves. There's 5 through there, and then behind that's another row. And this is actually a pretty impressive row right here, because it continues from that corner all the way through. And if we look up there, we will just see all the flags scattered in the woods, little orange flags marking these graves. And this cemetery was burials continued out here after emancipation up until about the 1930s. And Dan, I think you had something to say about it?
Graves, the burials did continue here up until the at least 1930s, because J.C. Willis, who lived here in Waverly Hall, he was, Mr. Willis lived to be up in his 80s. And he told me that he helped dig some graves in this cemetery back in the 30s when he was a young man. And he told me that this was the only cemetery around here that he knew of that in some areas of it you would hit water as soon as you would start digging. And he said that he remembered that he and several other guys would actually stand on a casket in the bubbling water while other people piled rocks on top of the casket to weight it down while it was covered up, because it kept trying to float to the surface. But it's also interesting to note the reason this is called the Sparks Cemetery is Mr. Whitehead passed away after the war, after Civil War. He died in like 1872 or 73 or something like that. We could actually go visit his grave if you'd like.
Yeah.
It's in the Waverly Hall Cemetery. After his death, the estate here was sold to a man named Wilkerson Sparks. And Mr. Sparks had a big plantation north of here in what's known as Pine Mountain Valley. And when Mr. Sparks moved here, he brought a lot of his emancipated slaves with him. They came here to tenant farm and to sharecrop. So they farmed all these several hundred acres that he had bought. And when their deaths occurred, they used this cemetery. So they were the ones that continued using it along with the Whiteheads up until the 1930s or 40s. And one in particular that I know is Miss Belle Carter. And Miss Belle Carter told me that her brother is buried here, and he was killed in about 1926 or 27. He was killed in a meeting at a Masonic lodge. There was an argument there, and he died upstairs in that lodge in a fight, and they brought him down here. Now she told me that he was buried very close to the road, and that she didn't know if his grave was ever still here because they kept it up for a while, and then the road grader came along and threw dirt on it, and she said they never could find it after that. So
That's fascinating, because there's one grave in particular that is very close to the road.
it is, and that could be his grave.
That's interesting. I'll have to try to find it. This is again where we're standing here, just lots and lots of graves. This is an area that I've continued to flag. Now as we get further back is where I stopped flagging. I ran out of time that day. But there are also some more interesting graves back there. So even if you can't see them on camera, because I know sometimes the indentions are a little bit hard to see, pretty much every step that we take in this cemetery, we're surrounded by graves. It's very fascinating to know. So again, this is an area I haven't flagged, but we'll see field stones throughout here like this one here. And they're not as easy to see, but the graves are still just in rows going through here. There's an indention there, and continues on. This part of the cemetery back here is one that I didn't really walk through much before, and I actually recently discovered when I was flagging the graves out here. So if you think of this cemetery as a square or a rectangle, is roughly the shape of it, this sticks out from that rectangle, and all the edges of the cemetery seem to be terraced. But just in this area that sticks out right here is a lot more graves that are in here, and like I said, because they were so hard to see, I walked around this area and just recently noticed all the burials out here.
I would imagine in wet weather this back here is very, very boggy.
These two graves right here, Dan just pointed out, very prominent indentions in the ground. There and there, and there's one behind it, and again, just all around us. Very neat, very deep indentions right here. Very well defined graves.
These are blueberries, aren't they? They look like blueberries.
I think these are blueberries. In fact, I think one of them is blooming up there. I think these are blueberries. I don't know. I somewhere I definitely saw some blueberries. And I saw the little bell blooms on them.
So it's like a crepe myrtle, but crepe myrtle forest behind that house and see if that's a blueberry patch.
Yeah. Some big blueberries. So this is what would be known as a cemetery artifact. In this cemetery, obviously an old crock right here that would probably have been used for flowers or something like that. Now in a case like this, especially in more modern cemeteries, people that will mean to do good will see old flower vases and that sort of thing that are broken, even old mason jars that were used for flower vases, and they will think they're doing the right thing by taking these items out of the cemetery and throwing them away in a cemetery cleanup. But that is the wrong thing to do because they are artifacts that belong to the cemetery. And for instance, this crock right here is an artifact that belongs to the cemetery. Now, what bothers me a little bit coming out here today, it's been about a month since I was here last, and to see that somebody has actually dug around this crock right here, you know, maybe just somebody was looking at it out here wandering around or something like that, but this is something that should definitely be left as an artifact for this enslaved burial ground. So like I say, a little bit disturbing to see someone's dug around it, and don't know why, but something like that definitely needs to stay here. And it is at the head of a grave. We have a field stone right here, and again a row of graves. There's another field stone over there and many more behind me, and we'll take a look at some other interesting graves in just a moment. Here's in front of me another row of graves. I don't see any field stone on these, but you can see deep indentions right there. There's another very deep one that we should be able to show up on camera. With that tree laying across it, we get a really good idea of just how deep that is. It's about a 2-foot depression, maybe 3-foot depression.
You know what that indicates to me?
What's that?
That was a very large casket.
Oh, really?
The deeper the indention there, that means the deeper the larger the void of casket space, grave space. In other words, if it was a large casket and it collapsed, then you're going to have a deeper indention.
That makes sense.
So the deeper indentions are the larger caskets. You notice that on some of these children's graves, they're very, very minor indentions. You hardly see them unless you look for them.
And so we've got a couple more really fascinating graves out here. For one, this field stone right here. This is very reminiscent of the Terry Church on the Mountain that Dan and I went to. Except at the Terry Church Cemetery, there were 30 of these sized field stones planted in the ground, but very neat, very tall field stone that was chosen to be placed here. And then over here we have another marked grave that's marked with a piece of marble. And it, there's no engraving on it, but just, you know, interesting later burial. Somebody was able to get a hold of this and use it for a headstone, even though it's not engraved, so that's kind of neat to see out here. And then down there, there's more field stone marking graves.
This fence used to surround one grave here, and it was about 4 feet tall. And you can see this grave is still mounded, which indicates it was a very nice burial. But of course it's just got a rock at this end. But they went to the expense of putting this nice fence around it.
All right, everybody, I hope you enjoyed this revisit to Samantha Street Cemetery here, aka the Whitehead Sparks Cemetery. Thanks again to Dan for coming out with us today, and I hope you guys enjoyed. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.